A little girl in a coma is mistreated, and when she wakes up, she asks the nurse for help. The afternoon sun seeped through the gaps in the shutters, painting golden stripes on the floor of the silent room. In the center of the room, a hospital bed contrasted with the childish decoration that still adorned the walls. Teddy bears and dolls smiled from their shelves, mute witnesses to the time that seemed to have stopped in that space. Lying on the bed, as still as a porcelain doll, was Julia. Her long brown hair spilled over the pillow, framing a pale, serene face. Her eyes, once full of life and curiosity, remained closed, as if she were in a deep sleep from which no one could wake her. It was into this scenario that Carlos entered for the first time. The young nurse, recently graduated and full of ideals, had been hired to look after Julia full-time. He stood in the doorway for a moment, absorbing the scene in front of him. The contrast between the life that should inhabit that nursery and the almost sepulchral stillness that reigned there hit him like a punch in the gut. Marcia, Julia's mother, was beside the bed, holding her daughter's inert hand. When she noticed Carlos's presence, she stood up, wiping her eyes to disguise the tears that insisted on falling. "You must be Carlos," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm Marcia, Julia's mother. Thank you for coming." Carlos nodded, taking a few steps into the room. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Oliveira. I wish it were under better circumstances." Marcia sighed, looking back at her daughter. "I wish it were too, but we're grateful for your help. Julia. She needs constant care." Carlos approached the bed, watching the girl with professional eyes. Despite her immobility, Julia didn't seem to be in a typical vegetative state. There was something in her expression, a softness in her features that suggested deep sleep rather than an irreversible condition. "How long has she been like this?" Carlos asked, starting to examine the medical equipment around the bed. "Almost a year," Marcia replied, her voice breaking slightly. "The doctors, they can't explain it. They say it's a rare type of coma, but that she could wake up at any time or never." Carlos nodded in understanding. He had already seen similar cases during his internship at the hospital, but something about this one seemed different. There was an uneasiness inside him, a feeling that there was more to this story than first met the eye. "I understand," he said gently. "I'll do my best to look after her, Mrs. Oliveira. You can count on me." Marcia smiled gratefully. "Please call me Marcia, and thank you, Carlos. You don't know how much this means to us." Just then, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, and a tall, serious-looking man entered the room. His well-cut suit and rigid posture contrasted with the melancholy atmosphere in the room. "Ah, Fernando," Marcia said, her tone changing subtly. "This is Carlos, Julia's new nurse." Fernando Oliveira cast a cold glance at Carlos, extending his hand in a brief, formal greeting. "Welcome. I hope you're up to the task." Carlos felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something about the way Fernando looked at Julia, a lack of emotion that seemed out of place for a concerned father. "I'll do my best, Mr. Oliveira," Carlos replied, maintaining a professional tone. Fernando nodded, showing no emotion. "Good. Marcia, we need to talk about some company matters. Carlos, I believe you can start your work now." With that, Fernando left the room, Marcia casting one last worried glance at Julia before following him. Carlos was left alone with his patient, the silence of the room broken only by the soft beeping of the monitors. He approached the bed, taking a closer look at Julia. Despite her condition, the girl looked healthy. Her skin had a normal color and her breathing was regular and calm. "Hello, Julia," Carlos said softly, even though he knew she probably couldn't hear him. "My name is Carlos. I'm going to look after you from now on. We'll work together to bring you back, okay?" As he spoke, Carlos noticed a slight tremor in Julia's eyelids. It was so subtle that he almost thought he had imagined it, but years of training had taught him to trust his instincts. "Julia," he called, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" There was no reply, but Carlos was sure of what he had seen. That small movement was a spark of hope, a sign that maybe, just maybe, Julia wasn't as far away as everyone thought. In the days that followed, Carlos plunged headlong into his new routine. He spent long hours in Julia's room, monitoring her vital signs, administering medication, and performing passive exercises to maintain circulation and prevent muscle atrophy. But as well as physical care, Carlos also talked to Julia. He read stories, told her about his day, and even sang softly some lullabies he remembered from his childhood. Although there was no visible response, he felt that he was somehow reaching the girl. Marcia often joined him, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and sadness as she observed Carlos's care. She shared stories about Julia before the accident, how she loved to dance ballet, her love of strawberry ice cream, and how she dreamed of being a vet when she grew up. She was always such a lively child, Marcia said one afternoon, running her fingers through her daughter's hair. It's hard to see her like this, so quiet. Carlos nodded, understanding. She's still there, Marcia, I'm sure of it. We just need to find a way to bring her back. While Marcia was a constant and loving presence, Fernando rarely appeared in the room. When he did, it was always brief and distant, as if the sight of Julia bothered him in some way. One night, while Carlos was doing his nightly rounds, he heard excited voices coming from the office downstairs. He recognized the voices of Marcia and Fernando. "We can't go on like this, Marcia." Fernando's voice sounded angry. "It's been a year. We have to consider other options." "What options, Fernando?" Marcia replied, her voice embittered. "She's my daughter. I'm not giving up on her." "What about us? Our lives are on hold because of this. Maybe it's time to think about a specialized institution." "Don't even think about it," Marcia interrupted, her voice rising in volume. "Julia stays at home with me. End of discussion." Carlos walked away silently, his heart heavy with what he had heard. The tension in the family was palpable, and he couldn't help but wonder how it affected Julia, even in her current state. As the weeks passed, Carlos began to notice small inconsistencies in Julia's condition. Sometimes her heartbeat would accelerate for no apparent reason. At other times, she seemed to react to external stimuli, such as a loud noise or a sudden change in light, albeit almost imperceptibly. Intrigued, Carlos began to keep a detailed diary of these occurrences. He meticulously wrote down every reaction, no matter how small, looking for a pattern that could explain what was happening. One afternoon, while reviewing his notes, Carlos noticed something strange. Julia's reactions seemed to be more frequent and intense on days when certain medications were administered, medications that, theoretically, should have the opposite effect. Frowning, Carlos decided to investigate further. He began to pay more attention to the medications he was administering, carefully checking each bottle and ampule. It was during one of these checks that he made a shocking discovery. One of the vials, which was supposed to contain a medication for neurological control, had a slightly different smell than usual. It was a subtle difference that could easily have gone unnoticed by someone less attentive. His heart racing, Carlos put the suspicious bottle away and decided to take it to an independent laboratory for analysis. He knew he was treading on dangerous territory, but his professional conscience and his growing attachment to Julia didn't allow him to ignore his suspicions. While waiting for the results of the analysis, Carlos stepped up his vigilance. He began to spend more time in Julia's room, carefully observing every reaction, every subtle change in her state. It was during one of these vigils that something extraordinary happened. Carlos was sitting beside the bed, quietly reading one of Julia's favorite books, a story about a girl who could talk to animals. Suddenly, he noticed a movement. Julia's fingers, which normally remained still, had moved. It was an almost imperceptible but undeniable movement. "Julia?" Carlos called out, leaning over the bed. "Can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly Julia's eyelids fluttered. It was only for an instant, but Carlos saw clearly when the girl's eyes opened slightly, revealing brown irises before closing again. "My God," Carlos murmured, his heart racing. "Julia, you're there. I knew it." If you're enjoying this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is very important to us. Now, let's get back to our story. Carlos could hardly contain his excitement. He wanted to run and call Marcia immediately, but something stopped him. The inconsistencies he had noticed, the suspicious bottle, he couldn't ignore his suspicions. Deciding to proceed with caution, Carlos opted to wait for the results of the analysis before sharing his discovery. He continued to monitor Julia closely, noticing with increasing certainty that the girl was, in fact, more responsive than she appeared. 2 days later, the results of the analysis arrived. Carlos opened the envelope with trembling hands, his heart racing as he read the report. His suspicions were correct. The medicine had been adulterated, mixed with a strong sedative that wasn't on Julia's prescription. The revelation hit him like a thunderbolt. Someone was deliberately keeping Julia sedated. But who? And why? Carlos knew he had to act, but he was also aware of the risks. He was about to accuse someone of a serious crime, and the implications could be devastating for everyone involved. After a sleepless night, weighing up his options, Carlos decided that his first action should be to talk to Marcia. If there was anyone in that house he could trust, it was her. The next morning, Carlos found Marcia in the kitchen, making coffee. He noticed the deep circles under her eyes, silent testimony to the nights she had not slept. "Marcia," he began, his voice low and serious, "we need to talk. It's about Julia." Marcia froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What's wrong? Is she all right?" Carlos hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's stable, but I've discovered something you need to know." Over the next few minutes, Carlos explained his observations, his suspicions, and finally, the results of the analysis. As he spoke, he saw Marcia's face go through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, steely determination. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who would do this to my daughter?" Carlos shook his head. "I don't know, Marcia. But we need to act. Julia needs proper medical help, without interference." Marcia nodded, wiping away a solitary tear. "You're right. Let's get her to the hospital right away." The events that followed seemed to happen in slow motion. Carlos and Marcia prepared Julia for transportation, explaining the situation to the emergency team that arrived within minutes. Fernando, surprisingly, was not at home that morning. At the hospital, a team of specialists took over Julia's case. Exams were carried out, medications were adjusted, and everyone waited anxiously for any sign of improvement. It was on the third night in hospital that it happened. Carlos was sitting next to Julia's bed, Marcia asleep in a nearby armchair, when he heard a soft sound, a moan, almost inaudible. Leaning over the bed, Carlos saw Julia's eyes slowly open. This time they remained open, blinking confusedly against the soft light of the room. "Julia," Carlos called softly, "can you hear me?" The girl blinked again, her eyes slowly focusing on Carlos's face. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Carlos felt his heart racing, a wave of emotion sweeping over him. "It's okay, Julia," he whispered, gently holding her hand. "You're safe now." Julia's eyes moved around the room, stopping on Marcia's sleeping figure. A tear trickled from the corner of her eye. "Mama," she murmured, her voice hoarse from disuse. The sound woke Marcia instantly. She jumped to her feet, rushing to the side of the bed. "Julia? My love?" Marcia called out, her voice laced with emotion. When their eyes met, it was as if time had stopped. Mother and daughter looked at each other, years of separation and anguish dissolving in a moment of pure connection. "Mama," Julia repeated more forcefully this time. Marcia burst into tears, carefully embracing her daughter. "Oh, my love, you've come back to me. You've come back." Carlos watched the scene with a mixture of joy and relief. After so long, so many doubts and struggles, Julia had finally woken up, but he knew that the road ahead would still be long and difficult. Over the next few days, Julia made slow but steady progress. Her speech gradually improved, and she began to regain some movement. With each small victory, Marcia's face lit up with renewed hope. Carlos remained by their side, helping with Julia's recovery and offering emotional support to Marcia. Fernando's absence was noticeable, but no one mentioned it. It was only a week after Julia woke up that Fernando finally showed up at the hospital. He entered the room hesitantly, his face a mask of contradictory emotions. Julia, who was sitting on the bed talking quietly to Marcia, paled at the sight of him. Her body tensed, and she gripped her mother's hand tightly. "Hello, Julia," Fernando said, his voice strangely restrained. "It's good to see you awake." Marcia gave her husband a hard look. "Where have you been, Fernando? Your daughter woke up a week ago." Fernando looked away, unable to face the accusation in Marcia's eyes. I needed time to think." Carlos, who was watching the scene from his chair in the corner, felt a wave of anger rise up inside him. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in a disturbing way. "Mr. Oliveira," he said, keeping his voice calm, "I think we have a lot to talk about." Fernando looked at Carlos, a flash of fear passing through his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Carlos stood up, approaching the bed. "About Julia's medications, about how they were tampered with. About why a healthy girl was left in a coma for almost a year." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcia looked from Carlos to Fernando, understanding and horror mixing on her face. "Fernando," she whispered, "what have you done?" Fernando staggered, leaning on the wall. His face was pale, drops of sweat forming on his forehead. I didn't mean to," he stammered. "You don't understand. She's not my daughter. I didn't ask for this." Julia let out a low sob, hiding her face in Marcia's shoulder. Carlos felt his heart break for the girl who had been through so much. "Explain yourself," Marcia demanded, her voice shaking with restrained anger. Fernando collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "At first, it was just a few tranquilizers. To help her sleep, I told myself, but then it got easier. The house was quiet. There were no more fights, no more arguments about how I wasn't a good father." Marcia stifled a scream, horrified. You did this on purpose? Kept my daughter sedated for a whole year?" Fernando nodded miserably. "I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted peace. I wanted it to be just the two of us again." The sound of a slap echoed through the room. Marcia had stood up, her hand still in the air after hitting Fernando's face. "Get out," she hissed. "Get out of here now and don't ever come back." Fernando staggered to his feet, casting one last glance at Julia before leaving the room. Carlos could hear his footsteps hurrying down the corridor, fleeing the scene of the crime he himself had created. Marcia turned to Carlos, tears running freely down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving my daughter." Carlos nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. "We're going to have to inform the authorities," he said softly. "What Fernando did is a serious crime." Marcia nodded, hugging Julia tightly. "I know. We'll do whatever it takes. But now, I just want to be with my daughter." In the months that followed, the Oliveira family's life underwent a complete transformation. Fernando was arrested, facing charges of child abuse and illegal administration of substances. Marcia began divorce proceedings, determined to rebuild her life alongside her daughter. Julia, for her part, faced a long road to recovery. Physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and psychological counseling became part of her daily routine. There were difficult days, moments of frustration and tears, but there was also laughter, small victories, and unwavering determination. Carlos remained by their side throughout the process. He had become more than a nurse. He was a friend, a confidant, a pillar of strength in difficult times. His dedication to Julia went beyond professional duty. He had become genuinely attached to the brave girl who was fighting to get her life back. One sunny afternoon, about 6 months after Julia's awakening, Carlos found them in the garden of the house. Julia was sitting in her wheelchair, an open book on her lap, while Marcia was watering the newly planted flowers. "Hello, you two," Carlos greeted, approaching with a smile. Julia raised her eyes from the book, her face lighting up. "Carlos, you came." "Of course I came," he replied, crouching down next to her. "I wouldn't miss our day of reading for anything." Marcia smiled, observing the interaction between the two of them. "Carlos, you've been such a blessing to us. I don't know how we could have gotten through all this without you." Carlos felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "You're both incredible," he said sincerely. "It's a privilege to be part of this journey." Julia reached out and took Carlos's hand. His movements were still a little clumsy, but each day brought improvements. "You're going to stay with us forever, aren't you, Carlos?" Julia's innocent question carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. Carlos looked at Marcia, seeing in her the same silent questioning. I'd love to," he replied softly. "If that's what you want." Marcia moved closer, putting a hand on Carlos's shoulder. "We do," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You've become part of our family, Carlos." At that moment, under the afternoon sun, a new family began to form. It wasn't conventional. It wasn't what either of them had planned, but it was real and full of love. Julia smiled, looking from her mother to Carlos. Can we read my favorite story today? The one about the girl who can talk to animals? Carlos laughed, taking the book from Julia's lap. Of course we can. In fact, I think we have our own amazing story to tell, don't we? As Carlos began to read, his voice mingling with the singing of the birds and the rustling of the leaves, Marcia watched her little family with a full heart. They had been through storms, faced darkness, but here they were, emerging into the light. The future was still uncertain. Julia still had a long way to go in her recovery. Marcia was still learning to trust again, and Carlos was sailing into uncharted waters, becoming part of a family he never expected to have. But at that moment, in that garden, with the sun warming their faces and the promise of a new beginning hanging in the air, everything seemed possible. They had survived the worst and were ready to face whatever came next, together. As the pages of the book turned, telling the story of a brave girl who could talk to animals, Carlos couldn't help but think that the real story of courage was right there in front of him. Julia, who had fought her way back from the abyss, Marcia, who had never given up on her daughter, and he himself, who had followed his instincts and his heart, even when the path seemed uncertain. Their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, difficult days and nights of doubt, but looking at Julia, seeing the glint of determination in her eyes, and at Marcia, with her silent strength, Carlos knew that they would face it all together. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Carlos closed the book, watching Julia, who was now sleeping peacefully in her chair. "She seems so at peace," Marcia commented softly, smoothing a lock of her daughter's hair. Carlos nodded. "She's strong, stronger than any of us imagined." Marcia looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, Carlos, for everything." He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "There's no need to thank me. We're in this together, remember?" At that moment, with dusk enveloping the garden in soft shadows, a silent promise was made. A promise to stick together, to face the challenges ahead, to build a future full of hope and love. As they pushed Julia's chair back into the house, Carlos reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them there. From a silent, dark room to this moment of peace and possibility. It was a journey he would never have imagined when he first entered that house, but one he wouldn't have traded for anything in the world. Night fell over the Oliveira house, but unlike so many nights before, this one was full of promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they would face it together. A family forged through adversity, united by love and strengthened by hope. And so, as the stars began to dot the night sky, Carlos, Marcia, and Julia prepared for another day in their new life. A life that, despite all the difficulties, was only just beginning. A life full of possibilities, second chances, and above all, love. The silence of the night was broken by Julia's soft laughter, waking up from her nap. "Have we finished the story?" she asked sleepily. Carlos smiled, exchanging a complicit glance with Marcia. "Actually," he replied, "I think our story is just beginning." And with those words, they entered the house, ready to write the next chapter of their lives, together. Life in the Oliveira household took on a new rhythm over the following months. Each day brought new challenges, but also new joys and small victories that were celebrated with enthusiasm. Julia continued to make remarkable progress in her recovery. Her determination was a constant source of inspiration to everyone around her. With the help of physiotherapists and occupational therapists, she gradually regained control of her movements. The day she took her first unaided steps was an exciting milestone for the whole family. "Look!" Julia exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement as she hesitantly walked down the corridor. "I'm walking on my own." Marcia and Carlos watched with tears in their eyes as the little girl advanced step by step. When Julia reached them, the three of them hugged, a mixture of laughter and tears of joy. "You did it, my love," Marcia whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "You're so strong and brave." Carlos smiled, feeling his chest swell with pride. "You're incredible, Julia. Don't ever doubt it." The daily routine of the house revolved around Julia's needs, but there was also room for moments of normality and fun. Carlos introduced board game nights, which quickly became a family tradition. Marcia rediscovered her love of painting and began decorating the walls of the house with colorful landscapes that brought life and joy to the environment. One Saturday afternoon, while Julia was at her physiotherapy session, Carlos found Marcia in the garden, working on a new painting. "This is turning out beautifully," he commented, admiring the painting which depicted a field of sunflowers under a vibrant blue sky. Marcia smiled, putting her brush aside. "Thank you. It's inspired by a memory from when Julia was little. We used to have picnics in a field that looked like this." Carlos sat down next to her, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. "Have you ever thought about exhibiting your works? They're really good." Marcia seemed surprised by the suggestion. "Have you? I've never seriously considered it." "I think you should," Carlos encouraged. "Your talent deserves to be seen." There was a moment of comfortable silence between them, broken only by birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Carlos," Marcia began, her voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about us." Carlos felt his heart racing. He had also been thinking a lot about them over the last few weeks, about the feelings that had been growing between them. "Me too," he replied, turning to face her. Marcia smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "You've become so important to us. To me. I know we started in an unconventional way, but sometimes the best love stories start in unexpected ways," Carlos added, taking her hand. Their eyes met. Years of pain and uncertainty giving way to new hope, a new beginning. "I love you, Marcia," Carlos said softly. "You and Julia. You've become my family." Tears glistened in Marcia's eyes. "We love you too, Carlos, more than you can imagine." At that moment, under the afternoon sun and surrounded by the scent of garden flowers, they shared their first kiss. It was gentle and sweet, full of promises for the future. The sound of laughter interrupted the moment. They turned to see Julia standing at the garden door, a broad smile on her face. "Finally," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with happiness. "I knew you loved each other." Carlos and Marcia laughed, holding out their arms for Julia to join them. The little girl ran, still a little clumsily, but full of enthusiasm, into the family embrace. "So, does this mean we can be a real family now?" Julia asked, looking hopefully from one to the other. Marcia and Carlos exchanged a look full of love and understanding. "We're already a family, darling," Marcia replied. "But yes, now it's official." The next few days were filled with a new energy. The house, which had once been a place of sadness and secrets, now overflowed with love and laughter. Carlos had officially moved in, bringing with him not only his possessions, but also a sense of completeness for the Oliveira family. Julia blossomed with constant love and support. Her recovery continued at an impressive pace, surpassing all medical expectations. She returned to school initially part-time, but was soon attending in full, eager to make up for lost time and make new friends. Marcia, inspired by Carlos's encouragement, organized a small exhibition of her paintings at a local gallery. To her surprise and delight, several of her works were sold, and she received invitations to exhibit elsewhere. "I never imagined this would be possible," she told Carlos on the opening night of the exhibition, her eyes shining with emotion. Carlos hugged her, kissing her forehead affectionately. "You're incredible, Marcia. I always knew you had this talent inside you." Life, of course, wasn't perfect. There were difficult days, moments of doubt and fear. The trauma of what they had been through sometimes resurfaced in nightmares or moments of unexpected anxiety. But together, they faced every challenge, every obstacle, making their bond even stronger. One evening, while they were having dinner together, Julia asked a question that took Carlos and Marcia by surprise. "Are you getting married?" she asked innocently, looking from one to the other expectantly. Carlos choked on his juice while Marcia was momentarily speechless. "Well," Carlos began, regaining his composure, "that's something your mother and I would have to talk about." Marcia nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "Yes, dear. It's an important decision that needs to be thought through carefully." Julia seemed satisfied with the answer. "Well, when you decide, I want to be the maid of honor, okay?" The three of them laughed, the tension of the moment dissipating. But the seed had been planted, and both Carlos and Marcia knew it was a conversation they would have soon. A few weeks later, on a weekend trip to the field of sunflowers that had inspired Marcia's painting, Carlos surprised everyone. In the middle of the golden flowers, with the sun setting over the horizon, he knelt down in front of Marcia and Julia. "You two are the best thing that has ever happened in my life," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Marcia, you taught me the true meaning of strength and love. And Julia, you showed me what courage and determination are. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Marcia, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Marcia's face as she nodded, unable to form words. Julia jumped for joy next to them, clapping enthusiastically. "Yes," Marcia finally managed to say. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." As Carlos put the ring on Marcia's finger, Julia joined in the embrace, the three of them united in a moment of pure happiness. The wedding was an intimate celebration a few months later, held in the garden of the house that had witnessed so many moments of their journey together. Julia, as promised, was the maid of honor, her radiant smile lighting up the entire ceremony. When Carlos and Marcia exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye among the guests. Their words spoke not only of love, but of overcoming, of second chances, and of the beauty that can emerge even in the darkest moments. "You saved me," Carlos said in his vows. "You showed me that family isn't just about blood, but about choice and love." "You brought us back to life," Marcia replied. "You gave us hope when we thought all was lost." And so, under the blue sky of a new day, Carlos, Marcia, and Julia Oliveira officially began their life as a family forged through adversity, united by love, and strengthened by hope. As the guests celebrated and music filled the air, the three shared a quiet moment together. "We're really happy now, aren't we?" Julia asked, looking at her parents adoringly. Carlos and Marcia exchanged a look full of love before replying in unison, "Yes, darling, we're really happy." And so their story continued. Not a fairy tale happily ever after, but something much more real and precious. A life full of love, challenges, laughter, and above all, a family that would face anything together.